Welcome to On the Line. I'm Christine Williams. Coming up, a look at who owns Jerusalem. Stay tuned. Jerusalem captures enormous press given its size, but not significance. It is the city often tied in to religious claims based on the world's three monotheistic religions that trace their roots back to Abraham: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Significant events have taken place in recent times, relatively speaking, that surrounds the question, who owns Jerusalem? Since World War I, critical documents and declarations have been signed. We'll address those. Our topic today is a complex one, not to mention an emotional one. My guest is Dr. Jaques Gautier, an international lawyer and academic who has spent the last 2 decades studying the rights to and ownership of Jerusalem. Once again, our lines are open for you to call in at any time with any of your questions or your comments, and don't be shy. Dr. Gautier, it's great to have you on with us today.
It's a privilege to be with you.
I am very intrigued by your work, and before I even ask my first question, there's a document I have here, a very heavy one that I want to show our audience. Take a look at it. Very heavy document indeed. Look at this thing. It's over 1,000 pages, and this is the work, Dr. Gautier, that you have done on your own.
Well, I started this over 20 years ago. At that time, I had no idea the amount of energy and time it would take to complete something that was comprehensive, because my aim was to look at the legal issues, to ascertain who had a valid claim legally. But you cannot deal with the legal aspects when you're tackling Jerusalem without looking at the history, without looking at the religious underpinnings of the various claims. And since this was intended to be a doctoral thesis, a scientific document, and I was told that everything had to be supported and defended, the end result was the 1,300 pages and 3,250 footnotes. I was not enjoying a lot of the technical work that had to be done, but looking back now, I think it's been helpful to have spent this much time looking at all the aspects of the issue.
What an enormous undertaking. And you are an international lawyer, and much of your specialization deals with human rights issues.
I have been studying international law for over 30 years, and I am a practicing international lawyer. But these questions involve human rights, as I will explain later.
Now, there's a lot to discuss over the next hour, but if you can explain on a surface level, there was a lot of emotions attached to who owns Jerusalem. Arabs making one claim, Jews making another, and somewhere in between. I'd like to know what your comment is about this.
Well, when you look at the claims, when you look at the basis for the claims, you have to start with the following statement. There are many claimants, and if you look at the history of the three religions, there's no doubt that there are grounds, there are valid grounds for the claims, whether it's from a religious perspective, for Jews, for Christians, for Muslims, that there are valid grounds for the claims from a historical perspective for all three religious groups. But the difficulty is to set aside the faith arguments, to set aside the purely historical attachments and connections, and focus, for me, on the legality of the issue.
Yes.
Who has the most solid legal claim? Who has the title, the right to say that we are title owners vis-a-vis Jerusalem? That's what I was searching for. And it was like putting together 10,000 pieces of a puzzle. When you undertake research on Jerusalem, and if any of the viewers intend to do that, it's often exasperating. It's often discouraging, because so many have written on the subject, whether it's from an historical, religious, or legal point of view. However, I discovered that there were so many contradictions, so many different conclusions, that somehow somebody had to be wrong. And that's why it took so long to put this puzzle together. But in the end, I reached certain conclusions, and I feel very comfortable in defending these conclusions as to who acquired the rights.
And as a lawyer, you certainly investigated both sides. Now, one thing for you watching that's very important to establish today is to give you a little bit of history. Now, we're going to try to make this as brief as possible, and it's not going to be presented in a way that will make you think you're in a history class, so to speak, but it's important to give you a bit of background because this is all part of the work that Dr. Gautier is doing in order to establish the case about who owns Jerusalem. Now, we have some billboards that we want to show you, and we're going to start off first, Dr. Gautier, with the first billboard that we have up here. Now, according to this one here, if we could have a close-up on this billboard, the subtitle here says, Jewish suburbs established since June 1967 beyond the Green Line, and Jewish suburbs developed prior to 1967.
Yes, it's important to understand that although my focus is the old city of Jerusalem, in a few moments I'm going to explain to you why it is such a bone of contention. But the old city is part of a municipality, the municipality of Jerusalem. And if we look at the municipality today, the boundaries were expanded after 1967, you will see that there's a line here which is referred to as the Green Line, yes, which divides what some refer to as East Jerusalem from what others refer to as West Jerusalem.
Okay, so we're looking at this line here.
That's
on
right.
The screen.
And it's important to understand what the Green Line really refers to. And it's considered by so many people to be sacred. And even jurists will make reference to the Green Line as if it was a sacred line in international law. In fact, it was the result of an agreement between Israel and Jordan in April of 1949. And there's a particular clause, Article 2, in that treaty that was signed. It was the Armistice Agreement, which says that this is a line that is not intended in any way to prejudice the rights, the claims, the positions of the parties. It's simply a military demarcation line. And yet today, whether you look at General Assembly resolutions, Security Council resolutions of the United Nations, that line keeps coming up. You have to understand who the claimants are today.
Yes.
Although there are many with claims, the principal claimants are Israel, the nation of Israel, and the Palestinians who
Yes.
inherited certain rights when the government of Jordan in 1988 gave up its claim to Jerusalem and transferred whatever rights they may have had to the Palestinian Authority, to the Palestinian people.
Okay, so are you ready for the next one?
Well, I think we can look at the, before we do though,
Yes.
it's important to note that in East Jerusalem, as we refer to it, all the blue dots, the blue areas, are now Jewish communities which have been built and expanded after 1967. So although East Jerusalem is often referred to as Arab East Jerusalem, it is in fact an area which is a mixture now of Arab communities and Jewish communities.
Okay, so let's look at our next diagram here.
Why my focus on the old city of Jerusalem? This is a subject that could take me the next 2 hours, and we don't have that.
Yes.
So in a few words, you have to understand that what you're looking at here, which is subdivided in 4 quarters, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, the Jewish quarter.
Okay, now just for our viewers here, this is here is the Christian quarter, the Muslim corner, the Jewish corner, and the Armenian quarter here. And here is a real point of dispute, and that's the Temple Mount,
That's Temple
that
Mount.
all of the three religions,
Many would refer
monotheistic,
to that
claim as their holy point.
Yeah, the ultimate powder keg, the most sacred of sacred areas, certainly for the Jewish people, but also sacred in Islam,
Right.
and sacred for Christians for other reasons,
Right.
is the Temple Mount. Now, why is the old city such a controversial area of Jerusalem? Why is it such a bone of contention? You have to understand that if you took pictures of Jerusalem over the last 20 centuries, until the latter part of the 19th century, Jerusalem was the old city. There was almost nothing outside the walls of the old city. So when historians, when religious writers focus on Jerusalem, almost always there's a recognition that this is the ultimate piece of real estate. It's only about 250 acres with 4 kilometers of walls, and yet so many of the holy sites that are very, very crucial in Judaism are either within the walls of the old city or just outside the walls. Similarly, the most holy sites in Islam are located within the walls of the old city, more specifically in the area referred to as the Temple Mount.
Now, these are clearly marked as the Muslim corridor, the Christian corridor, the Armenian, the Jewish, and of course the Temple Mount. They're very definite the way they're marked. Is this how it actually is, an actual fact, or is this just an academic rendition of what was meant to be?
Well, historically, that's the way the corridors are known.
Yes.
However, there's been encroachment over the last decades. There are Jewish people living in some of the Christian quarter and
these, of
so
course,
on and so
refer to
forth.
the demographics.
Well, they refer more to history.
Yes.
Because, in fact, right now, parts of the Christian quarter are inhabited by Muslim Palestinians. And so, but they're still known when you visit the old city as under these designations, under these names.
Okay, very interesting. And there's another document that Dr. Gautier has prepared here, and it's entitled "The Claims of the Zionist Organization Include Some Conditions." Now, I know that there's a lot of debate surrounding the whole Zionist movement, so just saying that name alone elicits reaction in many people, but we're going to get to that after the break. Don't go away. Hello again, and welcome back to our examination of who owns Jerusalem today. Dr. Jaques Gautier is with me. He's an international lawyer and an academic who has studied this for over 20 years. Now, once again, our lines are open for your questions or your comments, and we don't expect you to function at the level of Dr. Gautier, who is giving us his research over the past 20 years on who actually owns Jerusalem. So feel free to call in at any time with any of your questions or your comments, and don't be shy. Now, Dr. Gautier, before we move on here, because there's something very significant about the Balfour Declaration, but before we do that, the father of the modern-day Zionist movement, who is this? That bears a significance.
Okay, it's important to understand, as I direct you to the moment in history which made all the difference from a legal point of view to understand the background. In the late part of the 19th century, Theodor Herzl, published a thesis in 1896 in which he argued that the solution to the problems faced by the Jewish people over many centuries was the establishment of a Jewish state.
Yes.
After he published his thesis, he was the one that was behind the organization of a very crucial conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. And that's where a plan of action was designed for the Jewish people, led by this new organization, the Zionist organization. And it is their position that was ultimately presented in Paris at the Peace Conference in 1919, early 1919. Prior to that, in 1917, the Balfour Declaration of the British War Cabinet had been a very significant action, a very significant step in the evolution of the Zionist movement, because one government, and it was the British government, very powerful leaders during the war, that issued this declaration, which does not result in rights internationally binding on other nations, but it certainly was a commitment by the British government to help the establishment of a Jewish national home.
You see, I want to
in
stop
Palestine.
you for one moment here,
Sure.
because this is where we're still seeing the fallout to this day with that area known as Palestine. Because this Balfour Declaration virtually established Palestine as a territory, as a national home for the Jewish people. And we're still seeing that controversy going on today.
Okay. It did not establish it. It was an expression of support by the British authorities in regard to something that the Zionist movement wanted to do at a time when the whole world was at war. Eventually, the turning point is the Paris Peace Conference. For 6 months, leaders of what was referred to as the the principal Allied powers and many other nations met at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris and tried to make decisions on what to do with the territories of the nations who had lost the war in Europe and the Turks, the Ottomans in the Middle East.
Right.
This is where, when you study the history, you will find the most crucial facts. At this conference, and if we can turn to the board, you will see that the Zionist organization was one of the claimants. And in our legal system, people are familiar with a statement of claim. When you present a claim in a courtroom, the claim itself is not binding on anyone unless your arguments are recognized by the judges, unless they take your arguments and say, we agree, we recognize, it's now law. And this is what happens as a result of the events in Paris. The Zionist organization is asking those nations with the power to decide on the future of certain territories to recognize the historic title of the Jewish people to Palestine and the right for the Jews to reconstitute their national home there. Same conference, an Arab delegation led by Faisal, the most powerful tribe in the Middle East in those days was the Hashemite tribe. And he presented a claim to have one large independent Arab state created out of the territories of the defeated Turks. So the question becomes, what was the response of the nations, of the 5 countries, in fact, referred to as the Supreme Council of the Allied Powers? Did they accept or reject the claims presented by the Zionist organization, by the Arab people? During the Paris Peace Conference emerged a very important document, treaty, the Covenant of the League of Nations. And I can't get into the details, but in Article 22 of that covenant, which is the board that you have before you now, a new system was introduced. And they referred to that system as involving a sacred trust of mankind on behalf of certain peoples who were not yet ready to take over territories. And it becomes very important. This is one of the pillars of the legal arguments which I've been presenting.
And that takes us now to San Remo.
It takes us to San Remo, and I quickly must explain to you the tremendous importance of the San Remo conference that took place in 1920. As a result of all the deliberations and arguments in Paris for 6 months, the first 6 months of 1919, the Treaty of Versailles emerged. And decisions were made on what to do with territories of Europe, which chunks to take away from the Germans and their allies and give to others. But decisions were not made concerning the Ottoman territories.
Yes, of the Middle East.
Yeah, they heard the arguments and the presentations and the claims of the Zionist organization, of the Arabs, who incidentally were not disagreeing with each other in Paris. In fact, there was a treaty signed between Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist organization, and Faisal, the leader of the Arabs, in which they said they would support each other's claims. So we get to St. Remo, and the purpose of St. Remo was for the leaders to gather to deliberate on what to do with what they heard in Paris. And this is where the legal issue is tackled. This is where judgment is rendered, which I contend is still relevant today. Now, you should know that at that meeting, put this board up, the leaders of the most significant nations, the Supreme Councils, gathered, and I have a picture that I was able to obtain while I visited the villa in St. Remo. The villa that was before you a moment ago is called the Villa de Vachon, and the leaders met in this room. And that was the Supreme Council. They met in the 4 chairs at the end representing the 5 key nations, the US, the UK, France, Italy, and Japan. And you see here on the steps of the villa these leaders. And what do they decide? They make a decision taking the principles of the Balfour Declaration to establish, number 1, in Palestine, a Jewish home. They give the political rights vis-à-vis all of Palestine to the Jewish people, provided that the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of that area are respected. Therefore,
So there was input from the Arabs as well at that point.
enormous input, because the result in St. Remo is an event that should be celebrated by Jews and Arabs around the world, because at this conference it is decided that a large area of the former Ottoman territories, referred to as Mesopotamia then, Iraq now, or Lebanon and Syria, is to be for the benefit of the Arab inhabitants of those territories. So the largest area of the Ottoman territories goes to the Arabs as a result of the St. Remo decisions. But for the Jewish people, Palestine is supposed to be the setting. And then I'm referring to the area both west of the Jordan River and east of the Jordan River, comprising what is now Jordan today. The leader of the Zionist movement thought that this decision in international law was so relevant and so significant, was such a turning point, that he said, the St. Remo decision has come, that recognition of our rights in Palestine is embodied in a treaty with Turkey and has become part of international law. This is the most momentous political event in the whole history of our movement.
And that's a critical line there, in treaty with Turkey.
That's right.
It's a very significant line.
And he says it's no exaggeration to say in the entire history of our people since the exile. That's the significance of St. Remo. And I can show you the villa in question is still there because
to this date, and this is the...
I visited the villa.
Wow. Same location, just
a number of months
remodeled.
ago, and it's now a luxury condo, and I was able to actually stay in the very apartment where the area of the building where the decisions were made.
Wow, amazing.
So St. Remo is the place and time when those who had the power to make a decision made a decision in favor of the Jewish people in respect to an area called Palestine then, and in favor of the Arab people in regard to a huge area called Mesopotamia, Iraq, and another area which was Syria and Lebanon. Now, the result of this conference in St. Remo is the preparation of a number of treaties, one of which was the Mandate for Palestine. Now, this is an international treaty which is a source of rights and obligations. At the same time, a mandate for Iraq, a treaty, was prepared, and a mandate for Syria and Lebanon. In the mandate for Palestine, it is stipulated that it is the responsibility of the trustee, which was chosen, England, the UK, to take the steps necessary for the establishment of a Jewish national home as laid down in the preamble, and the preamble to that treaty specifies that the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine has been recognized, and the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. The very thing that was presented at the Paris Peace Conference by the Zionist organization, what they asked the group of leaders to recognize was in fact recognized. At the same time, what the Arabs were looking for, recognition for the support of a large independent Arab state, was recognized to the extent that chunks of the territories of the Ottomans were allocated to them under separate treaties.
But yet, Dr. Gautier, what is now recognized as the area of Jordan, what people refer to as Palestinian territory, there is so much division there. First of all, I'd like your comment on who comprises this area of Jordan, because I think a lot of people don't understand how varied the demographics of Jordan is. If you can just bring us up to speed on that.
Well, you have to understand that at the time of the Mandate for Palestine, it was not referred to as the Mandate for Palestine and Jordan. There was no Jordan. There was an area called Transjordan. Yes. The intent was for the entire area to be the location of the Jewish national home. There were political differences between the French and the British in 1920, 1921, resulting in a conflict, and Winston Churchill, under great pressure, allocated two-thirds of the area which was supposed to be for the national Jewish home. He gave that to the Hashemite family. The brother of Faisal, Abdullah, established an emirate and then eventually his kingdom there. So a lot of people have taken the position that if only that entire area had been available for the Jewish national home, a lot of the problems we're facing today trying to accommodate Jews and Palestinians in that area would not have been the same.
Wow. Lots of questions still remaining for Dr. Gautier, bringing us up to speed of what we're hearing in the news today and weighing it against what is actually real. Now, Dr. Gautier, you've done a fantastic job in bringing us up to date as to the legalities, but there are huge implications in regards to what we've heard. Once again, our lines are open for you to ask your questions and or give us your comments. We're going to return to the issue of who owns Jerusalem after the break. Don't go away. Hello again, and welcome back to our discussion on who owns Jerusalem. Once again, our lines are open for you to ask any of your questions. Now, listening to what Dr. Gautier presented, looking at the history and the actual legalities about the question of who owns Jerusalem, obviously there were many nations involved, including Arabs, that settled on certain treaties and declarations. But when we look at the modern-day news, there's a huge split. And the question, Dr. Gautier, that I have for you is, what's driving this? We see the Arabs fighting for something, the Jews fighting for something else. Based on what you presented, it seems cut and dry, yet according to modern-day news, it's not. Why is that?
Well, let me just deal with your statement as follows. To say that it's cut and dry is not something I can necessarily agree with from the perspective that it took me so long to put the picture together,
yes,
that it's unfair to suggest that anyone else could do this without a lot of research and spending a lot of time on the issue. So the answer to the question, who's got the rights, is not an obvious one. It takes a long time going through historical facts and a myriad of claims to get to a conclusion as to who has the best legal claim. But there's no doubt today that what's making this such a complex and controversial issue is linked to politics and is linked to religious beliefs. It's vital to understand that in Islamic law, let me do it this way. If the answer to the question was to whom does Jerusalem belong, was based on Islamic law, the answer would be it belongs to Muslims.
Yes,
because according to their theology, certain sites which in the past have been holy sites for the Muslims, there's an injunction, there's a commandment to repossess and control these particular territories.
So repossess is a critical word here, because when we were going through the history and the signing at San Remo, there was the Arab input.
There was a time when the positions were being presented in Paris and then subsequently debated in San Remo, where the Zionists supported the Arab movement and vice versa. But for religious, there was a big shift in Saudi, what is now known as Saudi Arabia, because the Hashemites, that family, that clan was replaced by the Saudis, who were much more stringent from a religious perspective. So today you have to be aware of replacement theology, which exists in Christianity, which exists in Islam, and basically says whatever was promised to the Jewish people in times past, even if there's a recognition that God was their God and God made promises to them, these promises have now been transferred to either Christians or Muslims. So this is part of the complexity of this whole situation. But I think I have to go back to the legal aspect here. A well-known principle of law is that certain things are referred to as lex lata and others as lex ferenda. The law the way it is, the law the way it ought to be. And what I've tried to come up with is my best analysis of the way the law is. You can disagree with me as to where the law should go or what the law should be. But I am taking the position that the issue concerning the status of Jerusalem, who has title to Jerusalem, has been settled. It is res judicata. It is chose jugée in favor of the Jewish people. Now, does that mean that the Arab inhabitants, the Palestinians, do not have rights within those territories? Of course not. Does that mean that we don't have, from a human rights point of view, an enormous tragedy faced by so many millions today as a result of the events of the last decades? Of course not. There are tragedies, there are calamities. But I believe that the starting point for negotiations, for anyone who really wants to get to the bottom of things and hopes to find a solution, is to go back to who was given title.
The issue of a Palestinian state is a very complex one. The way, again, it's put forth to the average population in the West is this is a territory that the Palestinians are fighting for. Hamas is, of course, in the mix. And these people need to have their own Palestinian state. I'd like to know what your feedback is on that.
Okay. We have to be careful because my expertise, as you know, relates to Jerusalem. So if I respond to your question, it's not as an expert on the entire Middle East problem.
Yes.
But let me say this. There is no doubt that a very large segment of what was referred to as Palestine in all the relevant legal documentation is already inhabited by Arabs. I'm referring to Jordan. To suggest today that the spirit and intent of these initial documents was in no way respected is not the truth. Today, there is a very, very large segment of what was Ottoman territory, known as Iraq, a very difficult recent history in that territory. There's another area known as Syria and another known as Lebanon.
Yes.
When the Supreme Council of the Allies pledged to honor certain commitments that had been made during the war to the Arabs, these leaders all said, we've honored these commitments by what we did in Mesopotamia, by what we did in Lebanon, by what we did in Syria. They went even beyond what they had committed by taking 2/3 of what was then Palestine and also giving that to the Arabs under the Hashemite regime. The Hashemites came from Arabia in those days, but the rulers are not former inhabitants of that area, but the majority of those who live in Jordan today can be referred to as Palestinians. So we're now looking at the remnant, this little slice of territory. We can refer to that as West Palestine historically. And we're trying to carve that up and trying to create two viable states in such a small area. No wonder the nations are having so much difficulty. Even if we didn't have all of the religious and political dimensions of the problem, the area is so small that it's very difficult to come up with a solution that pleases everyone.
Okay. Now the leader of Hamas, Khalid Mashal, he came up with a statement that you actually noted there because, strangely enough, it bears a close resemblance to Nehemiah for some reason.
Yeah, just a few weeks ago, he made this interesting statement. This is Khalid Mashal, who is the Hamas leader. He's based in Damascus. And basically he said that Jerusalem, for them, for Hamas, is all of Jerusalem, and not only East Jerusalem or the Abu Dis neighborhood of Jerusalem. And he stated that the Zionists have no claim over Jerusalem. I found that the choice of words was rather unique because as it's necessary, as I mentioned before, to study the history, to study the religious underpinnings of the problems. And I take a few words spoken by Nehemiah a long time ago, thousands of years ago, the Hebrew leader, and I read from the Hebrew Bible. And he declared, when confronted by his neighbors, including the Arab leader, referred to as an Arab, he says, the God of heaven will grant us success, and we as servants will start building, but you have no share or claim or stake in Jerusalem. So here we are, so many centuries later, and an Arab leader is saying, Jews, you have no claim. The Jews are continuing to say, no, no, not only do we have a claim, but it's a valid legal claim. So we're in the midst of very intense controversy right now.
Yes.
And for those who continue to study the situation, there's no doubt that the solution is more elusive than ever.
Well, in just listening to what you're saying, it would seem that these two sides, it's irreconcilable. There's no way to somehow bring some kind of a peace based on what you just said of the Hamas leader and what his belief system is about the lands.
Yeah. I wish my conclusion was different, Christine, but the more you look at the dimensions, the many dimensions of the problem, the more you realize how difficult it's going to be to bridge the gaps between the various claimants. I continue to believe that the way to a solution is to have a better understanding of the roots and the underpinnings of the claims of the other parties. If you are a Muslim, you need to understand the history and the religious and the political and the legal aspects of the Jewish claim, and vice versa. And once you have this knowledge, once you have this understanding, perhaps something can be constructed that will last.
Okay, now something we're going to deal with after the break, Dr. Gautier, is you've talked about the Arabs looking at the claims of the Jews, the legal claims that you presented here today. But I'm curious, when you say both sides have to look at one another, I'm curious after the break on what your answer will be to what can the Jewish people do differently to perhaps promote more peace in that region or some kind of a reconciliation. We'll be back after this. Don't go away. Welcome back to our discussion today about who owns Jerusalem. Dr. Jaques Gautier is with me. On the question, Dr. Gautier, about what could the Jews do to perhaps make things better or move toward a reconciliation in this very heated debate about ownership of Jerusalem and other territories as well?
Well, obviously, having spent so many years of my life working on this issue, I've interacted with many Jewish people, Jewish leaders, Christian leaders, and Muslim leaders. One of the problems is that although the Jewish people generally are able to explain the basis of their claim to Jerusalem from a religious perspective, or they're able to do so from an historical perspective, that it's very rare that I meet someone who does have an understanding of the strength of the legal claim. So one of the things that needs to happen is for the Jewish people to be more knowledgeable, more educated concerning their legal rights to Jerusalem. And the reason for that is that very often, whether it's at the United Nations or statements of different governments, what you hear is that the Jews are in Jerusalem illegally, that they are trespassers, that they are occupiers, that they're wrongfully there. Based on my conclusions, they have the right to be in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was given to them, subject to certain obligations and restrictions, yes, vis-à-vis the others who are there, but they are not trespassers. They are not illegally residents of Jerusalem, or for that matter, all of what used to be West Palestine. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is this more study, more research, more understanding must be acquired so that when you go to the negotiating table or when you have interaction with others, you don't start off from the perspective that you have no rights to be in Jerusalem.
Okay. Now, the next question I'm going to ask you, Dr. Gautier, I realize, and I want our audience to understand this, that your specialty is on who owns Jerusalem. And you made the case that they have certain rights. Obviously, the religious rights are one thing, but legal rights to Jerusalem. But at the same time, when one knows the rights, who do you present this to? Because we're seeing so many divisions presented. For example, the United Nations Durban Conference, for example. Once upon a time, there was the League of Nations. There was a United Nations that looked after the benefit of everybody involved. But it would seem like today the tables have turned somehow. And even with the United Nations, there is an element of the OIC that has its own set of human rights in the Declaration of the 1990s, where through the Islamic law, these rights were taken into consideration. So from the point of view of Israel presenting its case on its rights, is there any body today in existence that could honestly accept those rights and understand it and mediate between the Arabs and the Jews?
In theory, the answer to your question might be the International Court of Justice at The Hague. I don't believe that that particular court today is acting justly or has acted justly and is composed of individuals who are not more politically oriented than they are judicially oriented. The decision of 2004 in respect to the Fence case was an indication that that court has become more of a political entity now than a judicial body. I am interested in international justice. I'm interested in human rights.
Does it exist?
Well, when you see what's happening right now, and I want to give you an example of what I find so shameful and so discouraging. When you talk about the rights of Arabs within what is called Israel today, they in most respects have the same rights as the Jewish citizens of that nation. But what the world seems to be suggesting is that in the future, what would be normal is a territory like Gaza, which is completely without Jewish people, an area like Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan today, where the Jews have almost no rights whatsoever to immigrate or purchase land. And the reason there's such a fuss over Jewish settlements in what's called the West Bank or the occupied territory there is because it appears that in the future, if there is a Palestinian state there, Jews will not have any rights in that component of the territory as well. So there's a strange double standard where wherever the Jews are, rights of others have to be respected. But when it comes to the Jews, it's almost as if they're no longer part of what is human rights. They're not human. They don't have the same rights as others. As a lawyer, as one who is not Jewish, as a Christian, I am appalled and ashamed at what the nations are doing right now to disregard the rights of the Jewish people in that area of the world.
Now, in the same way that there were many forces involved, the Allies, and even with the declaration at San Remo, there was a combined involvement from Arabs and, of course, the Allies. Do you see any such declaration any time in the future, given the divisiveness that we're seeing, particularly with reference to the Jewish people?
Well,
or is it up for grabs, basically?
To give a valid answer to that question, Christine, I would have to be a prophet, and I'm not.
Well said.
But the current climate is not good, and it's getting worse. The ramifications of the Goldstone report are really, really huge. They're significant because it seems to be giving momentum to different initiatives around the world that are fueled by anti-Semitism. And so although one cannot say that there's no component of what the report in question deals with, it has to do with international justice. But there's no time to get into the details in that regard. But I'm very concerned about the current atmosphere, the current international mood, which is increasingly anti-Semitic.
Now, it would seem that you've already answered this question, but based on a lot of the feedback we've had in the past, I don't think everybody realizes that the United Nations is no longer an entity that it once was. I'd like to know your opinion on that.
Again, you're taking me very far away from my area of expertise.
Into international law.
Much has been written, much has been said about the role of the United Nations, the legitimacy of some of its actions, but I'm still one that believes that if we have a choice between no United Nations and this particular organization, it's better to have a place where people gather, negotiate,
of course,
and than not to have nothing. But again, there are huge concerns about the direction taken by the United Nations on different issues, not only in respect to what's happening in the Middle East, but that's another subject.
Well, Dr. Gautier, I want to commend you on making such a complex issue. Again, once again, look at this huge document here, over 1,000 pages, and bringing it down to an hour for us. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was certainly an eye-opener.
It's good to be with you.
That's all the time we have. See you again next time. I'm Christine Williams, and from all of us, thank you for watching.